Good evening everyone and welcome to the Resolution Foundation. I hope everyone has managed to grab a drink of some form, although I am worried that the combination of drinks and large plush seats is going to put you to sleep. So I will be watching, and there are three people at the back with like prodders. If anyone looks like they're going to start snoring, there's particularly people I can see lurking right at the back there, where there's at least 50% danger of snoring. We shall be watching. We're also going to vary the volume just randomly to induce fear as we go through the event. So the background, obviously, to what we're going to then spend some time debating today is 3 decades before the financial crisis of integration of a global economy of services, goods, people and capital, in the context of which most people, although not everyone, I'm sure there's some honourable exceptions here, talked about it both as if that was a good thing and as if it was inevitable. And people can now come to different views of both of those, but I'll give you a quote from Tony Blair in 2005 when he said, I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalisation. We're going to debate it tonight, by the way, but anyway. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. And that this is not just one quote, there's like a whole row, there's entire speeches of this stuff. And he's not the only one. It's like reading a tech company's manifesto nowadays. They are repeating exactly the same error on technology as we had on globalisation. Now, now I'm not going to bother going into why, but obviously over the last 10 years we live and learn. Most people, I don't know if anyone wants to repeat those quotes today, but most people are not repeating those kind of quotes today. And Stephen's book, I'm going to wave, anyone who's not bought it, I hope he's going to grab a copy upstairs afterwards, basically does a very good job of explaining some of how we got to where we got to pre-crisis, touches on that hubris, and talks about where we're going now. Now, Stephen is the senior economist at HSBC Holdings. I'm not sure how that differs from HSBC. It sounds very suspicious. Holdings.
I think you're trying to infer something
which is
entirely inaccurate.
There's no way that there's not a black cat being stroked in HSBC Holdings. Anyway, and he was the chief economist at HSBC, the normal legitimate bank, between 1998 and 2015. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. It's quite a depressing book. You haven't read it. It's called Grave New World, so you probably could have guessed that before you opened it. And in some ways, we shouldn't have been that surprised. His last book was called When the Money Runs Out. And obviously, the other Stephen King that writes books has a habit of trying to scare you, so maybe there's a kind of competition subliminally going on in all of that. Now, clearly the world we are in is quite scary for lots of reasons. Trump's quote, putting America first, big questions about where the global economy goes next. And the book, though, does a really good job of mixing the economic history of that with the flair, an enjoyable read, flair of writing. I don't recommend you all read every academic article about the end of globalisation, but this is enjoyable. On Brexit, we are apparently equated to Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. They're apparently very similar. Just to follow the It's All Grim theme, we're told that led to 150 years of war. So that'll perk you all up. There's also a great section on Hillary Clinton's $12,495 Armani jacket.
Yes.
Which was used at a speech decrying the impact of living standards on working people. You can kind of get where he's going with that. Anyway, so it's basically quite grim, and that's before we get to the future bit of the book. Now, so Stephen's going to depress us, and he's going to give us 20 minutes of depression about how bad the world is, and some of the possible answers.
Oh, yes.
Right, yes. Great. Some of the possible answers. And then we've got a great panel to talk through some of those issues. That's quite a hard thing to do.
I'm going to do this because otherwise they won't be able to see.
It's literally the heaviest lectern. It's okay.
God, that's impressive. I was going to stand there as well, but don't
were you? Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Not anymore. If anyone else would like to move any furniture, there's serious health and safety risks moving those chairs. Please don't do so. Anyway, and then Swati, who is a lecturer at the Department of Economics at LSE, is going to give us her take. She has some slides, just to reassure us that this is a serious event.
Yes.
And Kevin, who is an economist and a historian, and also a professor of economic history at the University of Oxford, is also going to give us his take, and then we'll hopefully get some questions or even thoughts from you before we wrap up. So that's the plan. If that wasn't what any of you were here for, or you thought this was about horror books, then now's the time to go. Before they all flee, Stephen, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I thought I would stand. I was going to stand. No, it's fine. I'm going to just stand here because everyone can then see me, I think. First of all, Torsten, thank you very much indeed for inviting all of us. And I'm also slightly intimidated that my fellow panellists are much more intimidating than I am. So I'm waiting for them to beat me up after I've given my 20 minutes. I started writing the book in 2015. I mention that because some people say, oh, it's just a response to Trump or whatever it might be. But I was thinking about this issue of globalization going into reverse really quite a few years back, and I finally put pen to paper or started typing away in 2015 itself. And I had two objections from people when I told them what I was doing. The first objection was, oh, come on, globalization is inevitable. You can't sort of stand in the way of it. It'll only go wrong in the very unlikely event that there's a Brexit or even more unimaginable, possibly a Donald Trump victory in the presidential election in 2016. So those things have now happened, so I feel slightly more confident that my story may have some basis in fact rather than simply a series of guesstimates for the future. The other thing that people said was that globalization was inevitable because of the onward march of technology. And this was, in one sense, quite a powerful argument. And in one sense, I think it reflects what Tony Blair was saying all those years ago, the idea that technology drives globalization forward, whether you like it or not. And it's captured in books like Tom Friedman's The World is Flat. But I felt also that thinking about history, there are lots of examples of where technology has advanced, but where, for some reason or another, countries, nations, empires have failed to embrace those technologies in a positive way, where suddenly the connections between countries and people and through markets and so on begin to break down, and they can break down sometimes quite violently. So the technology may be there, but it doesn't provide a guarantee that globalization continues. So I thought I should put more emphasis on ideas, institutions, the kinds of things that shape human behavior in one way or another. And these were actually more important in many ways than the technology itself. Technology would allow things to happen, but on its own, it could be used for both positive and negative purposes with regard to globalization. I also felt that in thinking about my sort of starting point for the book, I had to find a kind of straw man to aim at, and I found a very easy straw man. It's a little bit unfair on him, actually, because he's sort of disowned some of these arguments himself. But I was focusing specifically on Francis Fukuyama with his famous paper written in 1989, perfect timing, in fact, which was The End of History and The Last Man. And although Fukuyama himself accepted that the idea of the last man was one that might have problems associated with it, the idea that if you were the last man, there was no ambition, you were just as ordinary as everybody else, and society could become very ordinary under those circumstances, it was nevertheless the case that the paper was taken up by many people as an argument that basically said that Western liberal democracy, free market capitalism, had triumphed, that autocracies were inevitably now in retreat, and there was a kind of sense of universalism that Western values would now spread through to the rest of the world, that globalization would take off, and as it did so, would end up becoming collectively richer, wealthier, healthier, and the rest of the world would embrace all the same values and would end up with economies everywhere expanding at a rate of knots. So if you think, well, that's all true to a certain degree, but what's been different from what was expected back in 1989? Well, I've tried to identify a few of these differences. The first one, of course, is that autocracies and strong men have returned. The idea that they'd been banished and have liberal democracy spreading through everywhere, it hasn't really worked in quite that way. If you think about, say, I don't know, Putin in Russia, or Duterte in the Philippines, or Erdogan in Turkey, President Xi in China, got a lot of examples of people who don't quite seem to buy into the sort of Western liberal democratic values that we think are essential and would spread through to other parts of the world. The second challenge, I think, actually is China itself. It's a really big challenge because China has had this exceptional period of economic growth, extraordinary expansion, taking millions of people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last 30 or 40 years. Yet it's far from being the liberal democracy that Fukuyama in one sense was arguing for as being an essential part of the building blocks of sustained economic success. I'd also note that since 1989, the West itself has ended up struggling in a way that perhaps people hadn't anticipated at the time. And there are two specific struggles I'm going to refer to today. The first struggle is simply that the pace of economic growth has slowed down quite dramatically. And in some cases, this predates the global financial crisis, particularly in the US. There's evidence that productivity growth, which is kind of the magic secret source of economic success, that was slowing before the global financial crisis. And you look also in different parts of the Western world, you find that there's also inequality issues. And those vary from country and region to region. In the US, it's very much a standard inequality problem of the rich becoming richer and richer and richer and other people being left behind. In the UK, it's much more, I would say, a regional story whereby you've got Greater London making significant advances and, say, Wales being left behind. And in the Eurozone, it's a kind of almost a story nation-state by nation-state, most obviously in terms of the performance of, say, Germany versus Greece. But in all circumstances, you could say that the West seems to have got, in some sense, a poor part of the deal, the bargain associated with globalization since 1989. And in one sense, it's slightly odd because if you think about what has happened over the last few years, you still had a continuation, I would say, of some of the institutional arrangements that dominated the world from the Second World War onwards. And I think in thinking about this, you can guess kind of what's gone wrong. So if you go back to the 50s and 60s, the institutions that were created after Bretton Woods, I think were incredibly important in setting the rules of the game for a properly functioning global economy, or possibly a Western economy, thinking here of the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, very, very important, and actually the EU, which ultimately, I suppose, was founded on support from the Americans through the Marshall Plan, the creation of the OECD, and so on and so forth. And my point about this is that although we got rid of the empires of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, the US, in one sense, was first among equals, setting up a series of institutions, sponsoring a series of institutions worldwide, which set the rules of the game and allowed countries to engage with each other, and also, importantly, gave countries a helping hand if things went wrong. I accept that people have different interpretations of what happened in 1976 with the IMF bailout of the UK, but nevertheless, if you were Dennis Healey, you would say this was I think he described it as a Pyrrhic defeat, because, of course, he actually wanted the money to come in. He wanted to force the UK onto a more sustainable path than it had been in the first half of the 1970s. So if we had those institutions, they haven't really changed very much. Why is it that today suddenly we're in some degree of trouble? So I wanted to list a few of the reasons why maybe we've got more difficulty today than was the case in the past. The first is that the spread of, if you like, Western capitalism, free markets, didn't work quite as well as people had anticipated, particularly of the Latin American crises of the 1990s and also the Asian crisis of the 1990s. The second key factor, an important one actually, is that the American share of global GDP has been steadily shrinking, and as it shrinks, its power tends to sort of wane away a little bit. It just disappears. It's not quite as influential as it had been in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. A third factor, which is associated with this, is that as the global economy became more globalized, particularly with capital markets, it turned out that the institutions that had been created weren't so able to cope. And there's some really striking data looking at the changes in capital markets over the last 100, 150 years, and the extent to which we've globalized capital markets over that period of time. So you go back to around about 1900, you'll find that foreign ownership of capital assets around the world amounted to about 20% of global GDP, and of that, half of it was owned by the British, because the empire kind of mattered in those days. By 1945, at the end of the Second World War, that foreign ownership of global capital had dropped to just 5% of global GDP. So you're kind of living in the world almost of autarky at that particular point in time. We got back to 25% by 1980, but the numbers thereafter are absolutely astonishing. So by around about 2000, you're up to about 110%. By 2007, you're over 200%. And even now, we're down to about 190% or so. So you've got this extraordinary growth of cross-holdings of capital, of foreign capital. You haven't got any institutions to deal with it. And yet, people say something's got to deal with it. So we basically had faith in the markets. The markets would deal with it until we discovered that the markets couldn't deal with it with the onset of the global financial crisis. And then after the global financial crisis is out of the way, we discover that the pace of recovery is much weaker than people had expected. The income inequality problems become significantly greater as well. And that then requires a narrative to explain what has gone wrong. And here I think narratives are important, because when it comes to trying to explain to people what has gone wrong, what needs to be put right, there are a series of competing explanations for what has evolved over the course of the last few years. The first explanation is technology, not directly associated with globalization, although it's often difficult to separate one from the other, but technology in terms of things like, I don't know, zero-hours contracts, technology that has led to changes in labor market behavior, that has, particularly in the US, shown signs of destroying a lot of the clerical jobs, white-collar worker clerical jobs, which in turn has led to significant reductions in wage bargaining power. Another big change that's come through perhaps is education. Looking around the world, look at the PISA test for education around the world, you find that East Asia in particular scores incredibly highly. if you're in Shanghai or Hong Kong or Singapore or South Korea or Taiwan, your numeracy and literacy levels at the age of 15 are astonishingly high. The UK and in particular the US have fallen back quite considerably on those kinds of markings. So you might say that education has played a role over the course of the last few years. And then, of course, you can rely on other explanations as well, of which one is to blame the other, to say that the reason why our country is in trouble is because of people over there or people in our country which don't belong to our country over here who are causing difficulties for those of us who deserve to be in a particular country. And unfortunately, this is probably the least accurate message, but it's also, in one sense, the easiest message to sell. I mean, I would suggest that Trump did a very good job, unfortunately, of selling this message by saying effectively that he was putting Americans first, effectively saying that the reason why US growth had been weak for so many years was all to do with unfair competition from China or from Mexico or whatever it might be, but a sense that somehow he could blame the other for difficulties in the US. And of course, the US has a history of switching, veering from being in favor of globalization and open economy towards other periods of significant isolationism. And I think what's happened here, particularly in the West, is that there's now a sense that it's time to reclaim the nation state, to have almost a return to a sort of Hobbesian view of the world, whereby people here can look after themselves and protect themselves from people over there. And the consequence of that is that the West, which was the biggest proponent of globalization 20 or 30 years ago, has in some sense fallen out of love with globalization, forming a new narrative with the primacy of the nation state. And that creates some odd questions, not just for the West, but also for countries elsewhere in the world. And thinking about examples of this, the one I think is a particularly good example is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, there's lots of big debates about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But the most important thing from my point of view is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was an attempt by the US to create a new institution, which in one sense has similarities to the post-war institutions, which was designed to link the Americas with Asia-Pacific and to set the rules of the game in Washington rather than setting the rules of the game in Beijing. Now that TPP has gone, it raises all sorts of opportunities for China, which probably weren't there previously. And if you think about what China can now do, it's got the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an Asian trading bloc. It doesn't include the Americas, but nevertheless it's something which other countries may have to flock to under the circumstances where China is growing so quickly. It's got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the energy and security arrangement that links China, Russia, and the Central Asian republics. It's got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is effectively the key funder of Belt and Road initiatives. And you put all those three together and look at the countries that they cover and draw a map of the world, and you end up with something very odd, which is that if you think about the institutions that the US created post-war, it looks like what I describe as a kind of post-Columbus world. And you look at the institutions that China's now trying to create, it looks very much like a pre-Columbus world. And in one sense, you could argue that with China becoming more and more powerful, more effective, and creating institutions that rival the American-led institutions post-war, you end up with a very different kind of world whereby, first of all, you've got no longer one country that is, if you like, the big boss. You've got rivals. But you've also got rivals geographically whereby different parts of the world might move in different directions as a consequence of this kind of regionalization. I'd also note that China's attitude towards globalization is quite different from the sort of Fukuyama view, because Fukuyama was really saying that there was a kind of a set of universal values that the US already had that could be spread through to the rest of the world. If you look at President Xi's speech in Davos back in January, he was talking specifically about economic globalization. In other words, that China would not make a judgment about the political systems elsewhere in the world on condition that they didn't make a judgment about China's political system. So quite a different sort of view, I think, from the one that the Americans themselves tend to have. How am I doing for time? Am I
You're
okay?
doing fine. You can, no one's asleep yet.
That's good news. I'm
taking that
time.
as a triumph. So
that's
far.
probably good news. Anyway, so those are sort of where we are today. These are some of the strains and stresses that are coming through. But I wanted to just briefly mention a couple of 21st century wildcards, which I think make life particularly complicated in the years ahead, and which suggests that our attitudes towards globalization may change, they may morph, and perhaps we're ill-prepared to deal with some of these things. So the first big change is demographics, and in particular the impact of demographics on migration. There's some stunning numbers that the United Nations produces for demographic change around the different parts of the world over the course of the next 80 years or so. They're based on some pretty straightforward assumptions about fertility rates, infant mortality rates, life expectancy, and so on and so forth. And you get some really stark, amazing results. And they're amazing in one sense because they tell you that parts of the world that have really suffered are going to get a lot better in many ways, but they also raise some big questions about where people will be in the future. So the example I use in the book is Nigeria. Nigeria had a population back in 1950 of about 38 million. That compares with Italy's 47 million at the time. Nigeria today has a population of about 180 million. That compares with Italy's 60 million or so. On the UN's projections, that number rises in Nigeria to about 400 million or so by the middle of the century. And by the end of the century, of course I won't be around then to tell whether the numbers are right or not, but by the end of the century, they'll be up to around about 700 million plus, which is an enormous number. But if you think that Nigeria is a story in itself, you think about sub-Saharan Africa in general, and think about the same kinds of changes coming through in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the UN reckons that by 2100, about 40% of the world's population will be from that particular part of the world. Now, I would suggest that if you've got this extraordinary growth, and you've got gentle rises in living standards, you get people reaching a point whereby they can just about afford a one-way ticket that allows them to escape from where they are, which is generally pretty poor, and make the move to somewhere else where they can actually have a better life. So I think that the migration story that we've seen so far, which has been particularly shown by Syria and Afghanistan and so on, is actually in one sense a tiny dress rehearsal for the sort of thing we might be seeing over the course of the next few decades. And I think that raises some big questions about how the world responds. It also raises questions about the governance we have in the world, because there's no way that the institutions globally that we have today, G7, G20, IMF and so on, in any way reflect the population patterns that we'll see in 2050 or 2100. So there's some big issues there. The second wildcard is technology, which typically people think of as being a big positive for globalization. But I suggest two reasons why it's become a little more complicated over the course of the last few years, and become even more complicated in the future. The first of these actually is social media, because social media, I think, has encouraged what I describe as the kind of the herding of ideas, the herding of beliefs, the association of people with their own kind, if you like, rather than being challenged in terms of their particular views. When people first saw the internet, they thought it was a thing that would introduce truth to the world and you couldn't escape from the truth. But what it's actually done is created a series of clubs where you can join people who have similar beliefs to yours. And I think if you look back in history and think about the impact of similar technologies in the past, you can see how technologies don't necessarily enhance the world in a particularly positive way. I was looking back to 1971, where the technology of choice was, of course, the aerial that was connected to your TV, which allowed you to sort of see what was going on in the rest of the world. And 1971 was the year in which the Open University began. And you think it's a great thing, it's a way of educating people, giving people a second chance to get a university degree later in life, which is a wonderful thing. So I looked at the viewing figures for 1971 to see exactly what it was that people in Britain chose to watch. I'm afraid to tell you it wasn't the Open University. It was, in fact, on BBC One, the Black and White Minstrel Show, and on ITV it was Love Thy Neighbour, which had a similar kind of theme to it, if I can put it that politely. But the point is that when you have technology, it can lead to all sorts of positive effects, but also it can lead to negative effects as well. If you look at the flow of digital technology across borders around the world, it's exploded hugely over the course of the last few years. But all that's video, and all that's cat videos and porn, basically. So it's not entirely clear, again, that the volumes that we're seeing are quite as positive as we'd like to think. The second thing with technology is something where there's a big debate currently, but I think that one of the big issues here is the possibility that technology, particularly associated with robotics, leads to reshoring. Rather than seeing capital creating global supply chains that kind of dominated over the course of the last 40 or 50 years, we start to see something quite different, whereby, say, the US or Europe brings capital back home because they can make stuff with robots even more cheaply than they can with people living, say, in China or India or elsewhere in the world. The problem this creates, of course, is a series of gated communities, which actually makes the demographic and migration issue all the more interesting, because we can't spread wealth around the world. Then people themselves will travel to where the wealth is. It'll act as a magnet. So you might think that reshoring is a great idea in many ways, but of course it has a longer-term consequence that could be exactly the opposite of what people currently expect. I wanted to finish with a few words on what I think we've learned from the financial crisis, and also what we've learned in terms of the dependency we have on each other and the obligations we have towards each other. And it's something which is something that Germany and France will have to tackle in particular, and that Macron's been talking about already with the idea of a kind of common fiscal arrangement for Europe. But it relates to the idea that institutions do matter, and if you get them wrong, you can really suffer in quite a big way. I don't think we think enough about how these institutions should work at the international level. So I'm going to give you a kind of opposite example of this. I'm going to give a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that tonight, Washington, D.C. Is abolished, just got rid of altogether, and each of the US states becomes an independent nation. I want you to think about how their individual behaviors would change as a consequence of the eradication of all these fiscal systems, all these redistributive systems in the US, where you've only left with a single currency run by a Federal Reserve. That's the only thing you've got left. And I'd like to think about two particular states. So these states are Massachusetts and Mississippi. I've chosen those because Massachusetts is one of the richest states in the US, and I've chosen Mississippi as one of the poorest. And it also turns out the distance between Boston and Jackson, which is the capital of Mississippi, is almost identical to the distance between Berlin and Athens. I just put that out there as a sort of example of why you might be thinking this might be relevant. But the point about this is that, of course, as soon as you have the independence, the people of Massachusetts will discover that a lot of their tax dollars have been transferred to people of Mississippi over the course of the last few years. There's an election coming up, there's a recession, and they basically say, what the hell is going on? Why are we paying all the tax dollars to these people in Mississippi? That's now an independent nation state. So the tax dollars dry up. The people of Mississippi end up with a loss of the transfers. They end up with a large balance of payments current account deficit. They have no choice but to impose austerity. The austerity actually destroys their economy in a big way. And before you know it, rather than having a kind of collegiate relationship between US states, you've got a completely broken relationship just because of the abolition of Washington, D.C. And turn it on its head, of course, you've got the story of the problems in the Eurozone currently, that there are obligations from lenders to borrowers and vice versa, but we haven't quite worked out what those obligations should be, where the obligations of the borrowers end, where the obligations of the lenders begin. And without that, it's difficult to see how we can have a properly integrated and successful, healthy European story in the years ahead. I have a suggestion in the book that I think possibly could be helpful. It's what I call my Goth, which is the Global Organisation for Financial Flows. And the idea there is that if you have some kind of financial crisis and one country is suddenly threatened with the inability to fund its balance of payments deficit, then you have a kind of a holding period for a year where the Goth has funds to replace the funds that are drying up from the private sector as they try to escape from that particular country. That keeps that country on an even keel for a year or so. And in that year, the Goth decides to what extent that country is responsible for its own personal woes, and to what extent it might be the fault of the greedy lenders that lent too much in the first place, who themselves will be picking up some of the bill. And I think, in one sense, it's quite a neat solution to some of the issues that we've seen in terms of obligations over the last few years. The problem, of course, with this, as with most other things, is that when I come up with a solution, it is effectively a cross-border technocratic solution, which sounds great to my mind as an economist, but I also immediately recognize that given the political narrative in favor of blaming the other, it is actually very difficult to get agreement on these kinds of things. So just at the point where we need these things is precisely the point where actually it's difficult to get them working. So just to finish, if we can't rescue globalization from its current funk, what are we left with? Well, one possibility is total utter chaos, which would not be good. And the other possibility, I think, is that we end up with a series of regional stories beginning to emerge. Regional rivalries would take us back almost to the 19th century. So rather than having a Cold War or having a sort of US-dominated story that seemed to be coming through from the Fukuyama thesis, we end up with a series of different blocks in the world trying to push for their own agendas, trying to shape globalization on the basis of their own histories, because the histories are hugely different. And I end the book with, well, there's a little epilogue which is quite entertaining, but before I get to that, there's a little story comparing what we could see, not so much with Brave New World, which is the obvious comparison, but with the alternative book, which of course is 1984. Because in 1984, Orwell talked about these three regions of the world that are effectively at constant war and conflict with each other, normally 2 against 1. And those three are Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. If you simply change those names to the US, Russia, and China, you have something which approximates what we could be seeing in the years ahead. So on that particularly uplifting and cheerful note, I'll say thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, we also. That was great, Stephen. And hardly anybody has killed themselves during the course of the talk, so I think you can't see that bad. And you did have your answer at the end.
Yes.
Even if it has got a catchy name, the Goth. which means other things. I was want to put you, in some ways, your book is a book of two halves in one sense, which is, and you kind of illustrated it there in your conclusion about the possible world, which is a book about globalization as experienced by liberal democracies.
Yes.
And then the globalization, global globalization, bringing in other globalizations and other future potential globalizations. And just to focus on the first of those, which is what I was saying to you earlier, when we're trying to work out whether we're putting you in the fatalist camp or the this can be solved camp. So if your argument runs, liberal democracy has had this globalization phase, it has led to discontent, and you illustrate a variety of reasons, be it within country or between country inequalities. Then you say populists are exploiting that, and that is leading to where we are. You say technical answers can't solve that, either technically in some cases or politically, because you can't persuade everyone to listen to you, which is a shame, but everyone's listening tonight. And elites aren't trusted to argue for any of this anyway, so it's all for the birds, is basically the gist, just a further depression. But you then have this section at the end of your book where you say, but come on people, let's just challenge the populists anyway, because they haven't really got the answers. You have the bit where you say, let's just tell them that abolishing NATO isn't really going to help, and this other thing they're proposing, they're mad. You kind of have the anti-Nigel Farage phase of your book/life. Now the question is, which of those views is true? The fatalist bit, which is, oh my God, this is looking awful, or it's going to be okay because Donald Trump's going to cock it all up, and then we're going to point out to everybody that if they'd only listened to us in the first place, we could have told them this was going to go like this.
Well, I would like to think that people would take seriously the warnings of moving away from the global model, the integrated model, and recognise that although there may be political capital in it, it is something which is actually historically a dangerous thing to be doing, that you slip into a position which I think is rather worrying. So part of me says, just push this particular story. The other part of me says that we should be much clearer about the sort of choices we're making when we come up with a policy that appears to be re-erecting barriers or borders of one sort or another. So let's take immigration as an example of this. There are lots of different arguments about immigration, but I struggle with the fact that people don't seem to point out that if you don't have immigration and you've got an aging population, there are other difficult choices you have to make as a consequence. So you either wave a magic wand and have miraculous productivity growth, and no one's got that magic wand at the moment, so that doesn't really work. Or you decide that you have to get access to younger workers elsewhere in the world, in which case you have to export your capital elsewhere, which certainly Britain has not been particularly enthusiastic about, because it runs a large current account deficit, so it's not exporting capital out to the rest of the world. Oh, that sounds strange. Yep. Is my microphone, is it still on? Yes, it is still on.
It's an anti-migration microphone.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes.
It's worried where you're going.
Or of course the other possibility is you simply say that people, that is odd, isn't it?
Has it disappeared?
I'm afraid it's rubbing up against your
is that what it
chest.
That sounds very unpleasant for the microphone.
It is,
anyway.
it is great.
So the other possibility, of course, is that you say, well, you have to raise retirement age, and raise retirement age quite significantly. Yep. So if you spell out the choices, you might then say, well, of the choices, immigration in certain ways is not such a bad thing after all. But I haven't seen many people arguing that there are those kinds of connections, and that does bother me.
That's other people might want the Japanese choice, basically. They might want the more robots for caring. They might want higher employment for older workers as a price for not letting anybody in who's not Japanese.
Yes, although even there are difficulties. I mean, the other area of income inequality, or inequality in general, which I didn't talk about so much, is that once you're in a world of low growth and weak productivity and no immigration, then the danger is that to appease those people who are the dominant voters in your country, primarily the mature at the moment, the boomers, you simply rob someone else. So you put lots of money into pensions and healthcare and so on, and put very little money into education. But of course, longer term, that makes things arguably even worse. So
and that would never happen in the UK. That is definitely not
never,
happening right now.
happen in the UK.
Great.
No, unimaginable.
So what is your self-description? Fatalist, then, or is this challenging going to work out?
I'm a sort of accidental fatalist in the sense that I don't want to be a fatalist. I think there are things that could be done, but I worry, this is my fatalist part, that it is difficult to get the international coordination to do them.
Okay. I think we're calling you a fatalist. Anyway, right. Swati, tell us the answer.
Do you want me to stand?
You can stand, you can walk,
Okay.
you can sit.
So I decided to do slides so that I don't have to think at this hour. And here's what I'm going to talk about. If you're expecting a debate, you're not getting it here because I'm going to agree with pretty much everything Stephen said.
It's a lot of pressure on Kevin to disagree with everyone.
So this, I think, summarizes for me what the dilemma of globalization is. Essentially what you've got here on the lower panel is all manufacturing industries in Canada after they signed the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, what happened there. So the blue line is telling you what the FTA-induced productivity gains were in manufacturing, and the red line is telling you what the employment losses were. So essentially what we've got to take away from this picture is when you've got massive trade liberalization like the one that happened in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, you're going to get productivity growth. This was about 5%. That's not trivial. And at the same time, there was almost about a 5% loss in employment as well. So we've got job displacement coming together with these productivity gains. If you look at the highly impacted industries, which is anybody who got more than an 8% tariff cut, that's not such a big cut, but in general, it was big enough for Canadian standards. These numbers can go up 4 times. So we're talking about 22% employment losses in these industries, and at the same time, about a 20% growth rate. So massive growth rate coming from a trade policy induced change in Canada, and at the same time, massive employment losses as well. So the question is, a trade economist would tell you, well, yes, you should have compensated people adequately, everyone would have shared in the gains, everyone would have been really happy. But what we know now is that typically this has been done in a very half-hearted way. Trade adjustment assistance programs in the US, even in Canada here, have just not worked very well. Most of these people who did end up getting displaced in the US or in other countries ended up going on things like disability benefits. So that's not the sort of income support that is supposed to compensate these people. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? And my argument, I'm going to be a little more wishful thinking and try to make what you said optimistic, which is there is a sort of silver lining here. There is a solution, which is you compensate people enough. The problem is we've always tried to do that ex post. If you're hurt, we're going to try to compensate you with rather sort of weak programs in place. But there is a solution to that. We can try to be proactive. We don't always know ex ante who's going to be hurt, how much they're going to be hurt. So there has to be something which is so much more general, which tries to assist people, not just through globalization, but through some kind of economic change that happens that displaces them. We should have funds in place which compensate you sort of almost automatically, don't make you go through massive eligibility criteria which you have to fulfill to be able to get access to those funds. In the US, the story is pretty dismal. In the UK, actually, the UK did pretty well even during the financial crisis period. The Resolution Foundation made me change my slides so I could use their chart, so I'll show you their chart.
As everybody else should, by the way.
So if you plot people on the x-axis from who are the poorest to who are the richest, and you look at what happened to their incomes. Now, this is the post-crisis period. This is what's happening now. And how much is the government doing to assist these people who are at the lower end of the distribution? If you look at the same picture from the time of the financial crisis, the UK was actually doing pretty okay. They were compensating people who were hurt at the bottom end of the distribution enough that they could go up. What we see now, these are the projected changes. The policy is becoming more and more and more regressive. So the same, you should have sent more money to people at the lower end of the distribution if they're going through economic changes and they need to be funded. We're not seeing that happen. So, but there is a silver lining. We know institutions have got massively shaken up. That's shown up in the Leave vote, which has scared politicians to some degree. And this is essentially showing you on your left-hand side, people, what their median wages were in the particular county in the UK, and on the y-axis, it's the percentage of people in that county who voted to leave the European Union. If you look at that, there's clearly a sort of very strong relationship. People living in richer areas were more likely to vote to remain. And what's sort of really, in my opinion, very sad about the whole issue is that many of these counties which did vote overwhelmingly to leave, like Newcastle or Sunderland, are also the ones which are very exposed to the European Union, so that they're going to feel the hit of it much more. But it's not just about that if you're poor, you're going to vote to leave. It's a matter of that you've essentially seen social mobility being really, really low in your county. And this is what the second picture is picking up. It's showing you the social mobility index on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the same percentage of people who voted to leave. So what we see is that the same people, it's not just about what they earn today, it's about the prospect of what they're going to earn in the future as well, and that's where we failed. But we do know how to address those policies. And we need to look a little bit more inwards on how we're going to change domestic policy to be able to do that. So my wishful thinking, optimistic moment is maybe the government is thinking about that, and which is why we're hearing so much about modern industrial strategy. I can already see people nodding in disagreement. So all I'm going to end with is that yes, at the end of the day, there's no easy solution. And that's what Barry Eichengreen would say. The hard choices are going to be things like, are you willing to make the kinds of massive R&D investments or fiscal stimulus, etc., which are going to get these local economies regenerated and kick-started.
Great, thank you, Swati. We were so with you when you were, the optimism that something can be done, and then you went and ruined it with the government's almost certainly doing it, of which there is about a 5% chance.
I got very strong no's everywhere.
Yeah, the mood kind of flipped. Yeah, so but we live and learn on that. Or you're all just horrible cynics, and maybe it's all going to be fine in the next 5 years, whatever happens. Kevin.
Right. So I'm a historian of globalization, which means I'm also a historian of deglobalization, because we've had these ebbs and flows in the past, and there are at least 3 ways that globalization has gone into reverse in the past that are either relevant actually or potentially relevant for us today. The first is the experience of the late 19th century, steamships, railways around the world in 80 days. The world is getting smaller very quickly. Partly that implies cheap food, which is great if you're an English worker, but it's absolutely awful if you're a landowner or a farmer or a peasant in France or something. And those losers from globalization in many countries lobby their governments and get governments to put in place tariffs to protect them, because it's very scary. They feel like they're facing competition from what must have seemed like an almost infinite supply of very, very cheap land in the rest of the world. And the obvious analogy that you can make is obviously with blue-collar workers in industrial countries today who must feel very scared because they feel that they're facing potentially competition, what must seem like almost infinite supplies of very cheap labour elsewhere. So I think that there is something going on there that's a little bit analogous today with what happened 100 years ago. Second obvious example of deglobalization is the interwar period, which also can be seen as a kind of a response to globalization itself, but here it isn't trade that's the culprit, it's international money flows, because I don't have time to get into it, but part of what's going on is there are international creditors and they're debtors. The Germans are debtors, so there's a big recycling of money that needs to take place so the Germans can pay back reparations. There's money coming into banking systems and then being withdrawn from banking systems, and that happens in 1931, and this gives the Great Depression a second impetus. And so what had been a severe recession becomes something that goes on for years and years and years. And what happens if people see that they're facing unemployment for years and years and years is eventually they can lose hope and reach out for people who offer them hope and who are willing to think outside the box. There's an analogy there with what we're seeing today, because to be a liberal internationalist in the 30s, what that meant, among other things, was you were in favour of the gold standard, because the gold standard was a cosmopolitan way of organising international money arrangements. But it was a useless policy, actually. And the analogy there might be with the euro. I hate to admit, as a Europhile, but clearly that the analogy might be there. So what we've seen is we've had this huge financial crisis, 2008, which in the Eurozone is still dragging on, but and it's not been great anywhere else either, superimposed upon a sort of a secular, decades-long tendency towards increased trade and competition. So it's no surprise that things are now beginning to kick off. Politically, the third way in which globalization can go into reverse, hopefully isn't too relevant yet, is when you have the geopolitical system disturbed by the rise of new powers challenging the established hegemon. So we didn't cope very well with the rise of Japan or the rise of Germany 100 years ago, and we have to hope that we cope a little bit better with the rise of China and India and so on today. And there's a lot about that in Stephen's book, in fact, and I'll come back to that later on. If you think about it, it's remarkable we haven't seen a strong political expression of this backlash earlier. Because in America, as Stephen points out, median wages have been stagnant since I was 16 years old. That's when they last rose.
2 years ago.
Yeah, there you are, yeah. GDP's been rising, ordinary guys haven't seen their wages rise, the society is becoming more and more unequal. It's amazing that there hasn't been an explosion of anger before. There were a couple of false starts. There was Ross Perot, people may remember, there was Pat Buchanan, but every time they got swatted away and then people think, oh, there's no problem, the show can go on. But the warning signs have been there. This Brexit, Trump year that we've just lived through wasn't lightning out of a clear blue sky. There was a lot of academic work done in the early noughties looking at survey evidence from the 1990s. It was very clear then that in rich countries, blue-collar workers were hostile to trade and hostile to immigration. It was already there. And we did actually see a political manifestation of this in France in 2005 when there was the referendum on the constitutional treaty, which was voted down, some of you remember. And it was exactly the same coalition as we saw in 2016 in England and America. So every time it looked like something bad might happen, people got worried. We escaped by the skin of our teeth, and people got complacent. And hopefully now we're no longer going to be complacent. I've talked about globalization backlash. Maybe the word globalization is unhelpful in that regard, because globalization is many things. It's trade, it's capital flows, or international flows of money, it's migration, it's technology transfer, mostly expressed through multinationals and foreign direct investment. I'm dubious, I have to say, about the benefits of international capital flows. In principle, they're great. You send the money to poor countries where capital is scarce and they become more productive. In practice, it hasn't really worked out that way. The big flows are from China to America so they can consume more, and we have hot money and we have financial crises associated with it and so on. So I could do without that, quite as much of that dimension. Labor flows are potentially very helpful in alleviating poverty in poor countries, but I think politically, if there's no political leader in the West calling for open borders, there's probably a reason why that is so. So I think there will always be a limit to how open we're going to be there. FDI is really useful. FDI really does help poor countries catch up on rich countries, and I think trade is absolutely crucial. And I'd actually say it's more important for keeping the peace than for anything else, because if you look at the wars associated with the rise of Germany and Japan, partly they had to do with these rising powers' fears that they weren't going to be able to rely on the market to provide them with the food and natural resources that they needed, either to feed their people and their factories, or more negatively, to wage wars. And so you get resource grabs in Manchuria and so on. If you can't import what you want, there's always a temptation to grab it. And I mean, China has this Malacca dilemma they talk about. 60% of their oil comes through the Straits of Alaska. That's a scary place to be. And this is why actually the new Silk Road, there's a lot about in the book, I view as being completely positive, actually, geopolitically, because it's helping the Chinese avoid these chokehold, these choke point trade routes that actually make the world a riskier place. Now, in terms of whether you should be fatalist or not, I mean, the essential dilemma in social science is, do you think about structures and long-run impersonal forces, or do you bring individual decision makers and chance and contingency and free will into it? And of course, it's always a bit of both. So if various things had happened last year, Trump could easily not have won. If the Canard Enchaîné had come out with their stories about Fillon, during the Republican primaries, Juppé might well be president, and we wouldn't be talking about the implosion of the the entire political party system. So, and I believe in free will. So I think that we have choices to make always. I think it's maybe helpful to reconfigure this debate about globalization and protectionism or whatever into one about the market versus the state, because the pendulum swung an awful long way towards the state, or towards the market and away from the state, with globalization just being a facet of that. And maybe it's gone too far, or maybe you don't think it's gone too far, but you might just recognize that politically it's no longer as popular as it was, and maybe it's inevitable that it will swing back. So that's where the Davos people have it wrong. They wanted everything their own way. They wanted open international markets. They wanted to shrink the state domestically to become competitive, which of course meant that you couldn't have the social supports in place to help the losers. They wanted it all. And now there's a backlash, and surely the pendulum could be swinging back, in an era where private security firms are checking passports on the Danish-Swedish border. I mean, there are certain things that the private sector just shouldn't do, in my view. But where I think the protectionists have it wrong is if you're going to bring the state back, I mean, it's almost certainly not the case that the optimal place to bring the state back is just along frontiers and nowhere else. That's very unlikely to be an optimal policy reconfiguration. So let's think about bringing the state back. The state can, sometimes people say the state can't cope anymore, the world's too globalized, races to the bottom, competitive pressures. I think that's way overdone. I mean, if you're on the right, it's a useful thing to say because then you can say we should shrink the state, and if you're on the left, it's a useful thing to say because then you can say we should get rid of globalization. But actually, if you look within the European Union, never have 28 countries been more closely integrated together economically, and yet you have countries as different as Denmark and Ireland, completely different tax regimes. We have a lot more free will than we often think we do. There isn't a silver bullet. I think it's actually unhelpful to think about silver bullets because you won't find one, and when you don't find one, then you'll get fatalistic and depressed and say there's nothing you can do. I think there's lots and lots of little policies that are very often going to be specific to particular countries and circumstances that'll work in Ireland but not in Italy or in Germany and not in Britain, and that's what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about bringing back the state where that's necessary in a very pragmatic and contextual way. Africa, I think, is key. There's a lot about Africa in the book, and Stephen's absolutely right. The scene is now set for a mass wave of emigration from Africa to Europe, which Europe is never going to allow to happen. But those demographic pressures that now threaten us with a lot more drownings in the Mediterranean, right? They're also an opportunity. So I'll finish with this sort of thought that one of the problems that we're facing is that there's all these savers out there in China and Germany and so on. There's all this money being withdrawn from the system, is being saved, and there isn't enough good investment opportunities, which is why real interest rates are low, and this causes all sorts of problems in terms of maintaining aggregate demand and so on. But the fact that you have a very rapidly growing African population and a youthful African population means there's going to be huge investment demand in Africa. Investment, training, urban infrastructure, all sorts of things. If we can get the institutional setup in Africa right, then we've solved the problem of secular stagnation for the foreseeable future. We can save as much as we want. There'll be an unlimited demand for savings south of the Mediterranean. Of course, that will help reduce the migration pressures also if we get growth going there. And there are some reasons to be optimistic. Yes, a lot of their growth is probably commodity boom based, but look at Ethiopia. That looks like real growth to many people. And there's also, and I'll finish with this, an analogy made with Latin America. Latin America, after decolonization in the 1820s, went through 50 years of war and civil war and international war and boundary disputes, and it was a bit of a basket case. Africa, had the borders drawn in the wrong places when the Europeans left. There's been a shaking out process. It's not been pleasant, but there are signs that it's becoming more democratic, actually, and potentially more stable. And that's, if you want to be hopeful about the world, that's what we ought to be hopeful about. But in Europe, we have a major moral responsibility to help them. To help themselves.
Great, thank you very much. You're the clear winner of the Optimism Prize, which I think seems to involve the Chinese stopping lending us money and the Americans to consume stuff and instead giving it.
Well, I was going to say that the major reason to be optimistic as a European is that Brexit is going to be an incredibly teachable moment that's going to do it. But I thought I'd be undiplomatic, and so I didn't.
Well, I also think you do live in the UK. So
no, I don't. I live in Dublin.
Oh, do you? Okay, fine. Okay, fine. All right, okay.
Yeah.
I think I put you in the other category, and as Stephen said, the other is to blame for everything. So anyway, that's great. Actually, just to follow on one of the things you said, and actually I think this does come through in the book, the difference between this book and a lot of other, particularly American, focus on globalization is a lot of that literature is focused on it says it's talking about globalization, but it's really talking about trade.
Yes.
Whereas you do talk about trade and migration, but actually the bulk of the analysis is on financial flows of various forms. That's what comes across as your view about the overall driver.
Yes.
Some of it, particularly because of the focus on some of the post-war Bretton Woods phase, but also because we've just lived through a financial crisis which had something to do with financial flows.
Yes.
But is your, and Kevin was kind of getting this thing as well, is your view basically that the dominant driver, even so far as there's a structural trends from globalization, is through that vehicle rather than through trade flows? I mean, the two are obviously related, but
I think if you look at the data, you would say that in the 50s and 60s, it was primarily about trade flows. associated with successive GATT rounds and the commitment to opening up trade from the protectionism of the 1930s. I would say from the 1980s onwards, it's been dominated by capital flows. And the volumes that I mentioned in my comments have risen extraordinarily rapidly over that period of time. But also, I think they've allowed problems to fester for longer than might otherwise have been the case. So going back to your comments about the US and the income inequality numbers, of course, the way I would say that the US dealt with this for many, many years was simply to get people to rely on housing as a vehicle for gains in wealth, which was nothing to do with what they were earning. It was simply the idea if you widened the number of owners of housing and housing continuously went up, then what could possibly go wrong? Actually, I remember talking to someone that was very close to sort of the commercial side of the housing market in about 2006 or 2007. I just written with a colleague of mine at HSBC, we just written a big paper on the problems in the US housing market and how it might lead to a US recession. And this chap turned to me, he said, well, it's a very interesting paper, but of course you Brits don't really understand what's going on in America. You have your housing bubbles and busts, but we haven't had any busts since the Second World War. We're not worried about it. And I said, well, isn't that precisely why you should be worried about it? Because it's precisely those kinds of sentiments that tend to lead to these kinds of difficulties. But of course we know that in part the housing bubble in the US was precisely funded through money flowing in from China and elsewhere that probably led to lower interest rates than would otherwise have been the case. So you know, there were difficulties created as a consequence of that. But the difficulties masked the underlying imbalances that were opening up in terms of income within the US itself.
That's great. Right, let's get some of your questions, thoughts. The gentleman in the pink shirt is very keen, so it better be really good now. You're getting a microphone. Wait a second, sir. Wait. Use the microphone. Then we can hear every word.
One of my frustrations about the globalization narrative is that I don't think it's ever been absolutely true. So if you take the East Asian countries as an example, they've been very good at opening to the world in an export sense, but they've been very good at protecting their economies in a domestic sense. Go to South Korea and all the cars on the roads are Hyundais, their fridges are Korean made, their mobile phones are Korean made, and they think that everything Korean is good and everything from anywhere else is no good. And to extend the Korean example closer to home, my Samsung TV comes from Slovakia. There's the European external tariff on television sets is 14%. So presumably it's been made in Slovakia because that gets round the European tariff.
Yep.
And that, of course, is exactly what we'll face if we jump out of Brexit in a total sense. So my point is, it was never really as globalized as the narrative said it was. And countries have been structuring their trade by using very strong methods of border control, even through the globalization period. And surely this means this is something that we can do, that if we look at the African problem that's been referred to, there are ways in which we can structure economic growth to address these developmental difficulties.
Okay, I think we get that. That's one for you, Swati, in a second. Well, Vicky is next to you.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask two questions of Stephen? Are you actually, and perhaps also Kevin's thing, are we suggesting, or are you suggesting or implying that there should be capital controls reinstated so that we go seriously backwards in that respect? Is that the solution? And as far as... You
sound quite 50-50 on that yourself.
No, I'm completely against capital.
Yeah, we got that.
And for Swati, really, it's interesting what you said about Canada. Is there any evidence that this happened at all for the UK when it joined the EU? And I don't think that was actually the case. So we can't just look at the Canadian model and what happened there and draw any conclusions, really.
Great. Let's get one more question and then we'll come back to the panel. Okay, well, let's take one more from the front row here. Wait 1 second. And then we'll move to this side. All three are from you next time.
Globalisation in Tottenham means that there are international property developers buying council properties like around most of London, leaving them empty, increasing rents, increasing the price of housing. That actually takes more of the income the low incomes indeed that are needed for food, clothes, fuel, transport and other necessities. So globalization means poverty after housing cost is increasing, and as you said, is going to get a lot worse by 2020, according to the Resolution Foundation. And the consequence of that is there is an undoubted and proven relationship between low incomes and ill health. And there is a real, for the first time in many years, in the United Kingdom, there's been an unprecedented rise in the death rate and an unprecedented rise in infant deaths. So the squeeze of globalization on local incomes, taking the basic income needed for good health, is having a very, very, very damaging effect on health, and that's globalization in Tottenham.
Right, thank you for globalisation in Tottenham. Right, let's start with the first question. I'm going to unfairly characterise as the Jeremy Corbyn globalisation question, which is there a world open to us? Are we wrong to have thought that we had the gains really were that big and everyone else was cheating the system? Why don't we do what Korea does?
In terms of industrial policy, or in terms of trade?
Well, I think you're arguing for a mix of industrial policy and tougher on other countries who are stuffing us over a bit.
So,
yeah. Okay.
I mean, typically when governments have tried to do that, which is, so I'm from India and I can talk about that context in great detail. The tariff rates sometimes were even 100% plus in certain industries, and precisely with the idea that we want to develop our own car industry and therefore it's totally fine to have 200% tariffs. What happened was you ended up with one company which essentially made cars which nobody wants to drive. It's completely gone now. So, I mean, I think there is this danger, which is that you tend to become protectionist and you also tend to kill competition. And I think what it does is sort of these simple solutions about let's put tariffs back is taking the argument away from the really, really crucial issues, which is how do we make sure that domestic policy addresses those who lose, and more importantly, there are many other components of globalization which in the world trading system doesn't handle very well. One of them is, of course, international capital flows. Another one is, well, investor rights, which are given investors get special rights everywhere they go, while labor does not. So in that sense, that asymmetry is not what's being pointed out. What's instead being pointed out is, well, why can't we be Korea? Why can't we be Singapore and use industrial policy in some really smart way, protect our borders first, and then sort of, you know, when we're competitive, we'll open up. Well, that date and age is gone. We've had all of that privilege already. And at that point, yes, we did have high tariff levels. And Kevin can correct me on what I've got wrong there.
Well, I'm not going to correct you on India. Everybody agrees that Indian protection was disastrous. But I think that there was a phase in world history from, say, 1850 to, I think, the 1960s, in which countries that grew really strongly, usually, Japan is an exception, because there's an exception to every rule, generally grew by mimicking what was being done in the advanced countries. And they very often protected their markets. The Americans did it, the Germans did it, the Italians did it, and so on. Now, if you're going to play that game, you need a big market. You know, so if you're small, Ireland tried to do it in the 30s, and we didn't have a big market. You know, the Koreans, the Taiwanese were maybe the last ones to do that, but it was very different from the Latin American or the Indian experience in that they were protectionist, as you say, but outward oriented. So they had different companies competing with each other in a cutthroat manner, being rewarded if they were exporting more, but they were protected to get off the ground. And I think it was completely successful intervention, actually. But it relied on openness. It relied on our openness. I think it doesn't follow that America in the same period would have benefited from protectionism, or even England, which was a good bit behind Britain, because once you get beyond a certain developmental level, then it's no longer about taking off-the-shelf blueprints and starting to make the fridges of the cars or whatever. I mean, you need to mobilize the savings and get it off the ground. It's about innovating and so on, and protectionism isn't necessarily brilliant for that. And the final point is that there's now a whole different type of development strategy for the very poor, which is plugging into the global value chains that Richard Baldwin always talks about. So the reason, arguably, why Korea had to do what it did was you needed the iron and steel to produce the cars, you needed this to produce that, and so you needed everything at once. And so the market was never going to do that for you, so you had to move across a broad front. And so there's this big push, classic argument for protection. But now you can just produce a little widget, you know, and plug into somebody else's supply chain and import that best practice technology. And countries like Vietnam are growing very, very quickly. So
that might be a good point. Do you want to comment on the Baldwin versus King controversy on this reshoring question?
Well, I think that's a really interesting suggestion of Stephen. And it's sort of, well, we are seeing a bit of reshoring, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Already.
Yeah. Particularly in the US.
Yeah.
So this is the debate about. So Stephen says, as you mentioned in your talk now, growth in technology is allowing people to use machines to reshore manufacturing from developing or now emerged economies back to the developed world. Whereas Richard Baldwin's argument is more that the future is global value chains where the widgets can be produced, will be produced at different places, and that will keep us all. Yeah. That's the new future of globalization.
Yeah. Two very different implications for global income dynamics.
Absolutely,
and everything.
yes.
So I don't know if he's right, but.
Wait, have you had a row with him yet or not?
He's reading my book at the moment because he's talked about it on Twitter, but I've yet to get the response for that particular chapter.
So as always, it went talked about it on Twitter, then read the book.
No, he photographed himself reading the book on Twitter.
Oh, I see. Fine. That's
it was very precise.
That's much better.
Very, very precise.
Yeah, that's odd, but
can I just say something about this Asian issue? Actually, there's a very nice book. It's a short book, which is always an advantage, by a guy called Joe Studwell, who's basically a journalist working in Asia. He's covered the economies for many, many years. It's called Why Asia Works, and it's all about the specific policies that Asian governments pursued, is primarily East Asian governments, pursued over the last 50 or 60 years to try to get their economies working more effectively. And it was, as you say, it was mostly a story about making sure that they produce goods for the international market rather than for the domestic market, making sure they were selling goods to people who wanted the best rather than the people at home who might put up with something that was more mediocre. But by doing that, and effectively creating this competitive environment whereby the government gave credit to different companies and would then check to see whether the company were performing internationally appropriately, increasing their market share, you had a competitive world, but it wasn't selling to the local people. It was selling to people elsewhere in the world. But by getting very powerful productivity gains, the local people themselves eventually became richer and able to consume these things. But it didn't happen in the way that is a pure sort of free market solution, but nor did it happen in the way that was protectionist in terms of protecting domestic industries from productive competitors elsewhere in the world.
Now, we need to deal with Vicky's question, which is, are you, quote, actually calling for return of capital controls?
Well, you might be, Kevin. I'm not really. Well, I work for a bank, so, I mean,
that's going to be very expensive.
like sort of, turkeys waiting for Christmas or something like that. But more importantly, I do think there is a really big issue about what happens when things go wrong. This is where I talk about this Goth idea, the Global Organisation for Financial Flows. Because when things have gone wrong, particularly since the global financial crisis, one country's sovereignty has ended up being an attack on another country's sovereignty, if I can put it. Well, you know this, Vicky, more than I do, really, but I mean, the way in which Greece has been treated over the last 2 or 3 years is akin to the way that Egypt was treated in whenever it was the 1870s, 1880s, when it got into financial crisis after the Suez Canal was constructed. And effectively it was the French and the British who imposed rules on the Egyptians, which then led eventually to an uprising and a coup. It strikes me that if you've got a system whereby one country, particularly a creditor nation, is in a powerful position to say, whatever happens, we're going to do nothing because it's always the other person's fault, then you're going back to sort of the moralizing of the 19th century with the Marshalsea debtors prison and so on. I mean, it's just madness. So I think the issue is not so much the capital flows themselves, but rather what do you do in the event that there are significant losses? How do you distribute those losses across borders? And what kind of international institution could we have to deal with that? Now, again, I would say that with my sort of economics hat on, I think something like the Goth would be quite a nice thing to do. I'm also acutely aware that getting organised, getting the Germans, for example, to agree to an idea that says you're going to be on the hook when things go wrong, it's been very difficult to get that working, because I remember talking to a German policymaker once, and he said to me, I asked him what the secrets of German success were, and he said, well, it's hard work and low inflation and being competitive and running a balance of payments current account surplus. I said, do you think that every country in the world should follow the German model? He said, yes, be competitive, low inflation. And he stopped and said, but you tricked me on that current account surplus question, haven't you? I said, yeah, too right. So I think there's a huge difficulty with regard to seeing surpluses as good and deficits as bad, but it's actually adding to the secular stagnation story to a degree, which is namely that that every country thinks they should have a surplus, and of course the world as a whole does become incredibly deflationary, which doesn't help anyone.
Kevin, do you want to defend yourself on capital controls?
I'm not calling for them in some blanket sense, but if some country like Malaysia, in the 90s decided that why not, then I think why not. I think these things are often contextual. They're supposed to diversify away risk. Well, I've seen them kind of generate risk, I think, and they're supposed to reallocate savings efficiently, and I don't see any great sense of that. And finally, there's a big literature about whether trade makes us all friends with each other and helps reduce the risk of war. But borrowing and lending doesn't necessarily make us friends at all, as as you're alluding to. So, I don't think they're an unmitigatedly great thing.
On Vicky's second question, which by the way is a clear breach of the one question rule, but there on Vicky's second question, which is is your view that your result is generalizable or not?
I think it's very generalizable in the sense that when you have economic change and you have big productivity gains, it typically comes with some kind of displacement as well. More broadly speaking, on the specific point that what happened with the single market case, typically the academic literature would say that real wages actually increased a little bit in the UK and unemployment went down slightly. The reason for that was there were all these export opportunities which got opened up at the same time as when you had import competition coming in, or migration, or any of these other aspects. But I think the broader point is still relevant for the UK, because we're talking about not just globalization in the narrow sense of the word, but we're talking about sort of, at least what I was talking about was economic change. And whether it's automation, whether it's the rise of services, and what happens when China and India somehow start exporting services to the UK, I think all of these issues are relevant from that point of view. But I totally take your point that this is sort of one particular type of example, and the EU case might not be a replication of that.
Do they want to touch on foreign capital buying up flats in Tottenham or otherwise?
Yes, actually, oddly enough, there is a section in the book on exactly that, not mentioning Tottenham specifically, but this partly stemmed from I was on a trip to Singapore and I was talking to a property development company, and they were telling me about their plans to invest in London. And I said, well, this is great. Obviously London needs, homes being built. We've got a shortage of home. Oh, I wasn't going to build them to sell to Londoners. We want to sell them to Singaporeans. And there's, I think, a powerful belief in parts of Asia that London and other places are good homes for money that is basically hidden from the country they happen to be originating in. We have good property rights and so on, so people want to come to London. And I think it has made a small contribution to some of the difficulties that clearly have come through within the capital. In one way, this is a sort of vague capital control type of thing, but you could do what Singapore itself does, which is to make it much more expensive for foreigners to buy property in Singapore than for domestic residents. And I haven't really thought about that in detail, but it is a possible way of dealing with some of these housing difficulties.
Can I ask a question?
But, well, yes, it's always a
I want to get some more questions in, because you want to quickly on that.
Well,
Kevin,
just Denmark's been one of the most globalized countries in the world for well over 100 years. They live and die by trade. They don't have these problems because they have different domestic policies. This is domestic policy failure. Well, they have taxes, but they, for example, have rules that you can't just have a flat in Copenhagen and leave it vacant. That's actually illegal. The council will make you rent it. Countries can do whatever they want, and if they do things that lead to housing crises, then they shouldn't blame the rest of the world.
Great, right. Let's get 3 quick questions from over here. There's a lady just here. Rob, do you want to bring another microphone there? We can go ahead.
Thank you. Mary Dashevsky, I write for The Independent and other papers. I was covering the US back in the late 90s, and there were the huge anti-globalization protests in Seattle, Vancouver, all over the place. And then we've seen Occupy since. Were these movements right and simply ignored?
That is a very good question, but I'm going to rider to that for you to come to think about, which is, how is it that the anti-globalization movement moved from being anti-globalization from the perspective of, it was almost like from the perspective of the third world, developing world, and it's now moved to being an anti-globalization world because we're all very worried about people here. And when did that tip in? Because those people were protesting about different things in those 2 phases. But anyway, very good. Right, question here at the front.
My question is somewhat apocalyptic. I don't necessarily
just to pick the mood up this evening. Thanks.
I don't necessarily believe it, but I think it's something we should be debating. Yes, we're seeing onshoring, but I'm afraid that's going to be rather short-lived. Because if you look at the growth of robots in Asia, it's many times what it is in Europe. Foxconn, who make Apple products, are installing factories now peopled almost entirely by robots.
So this is your apocalypse is no jobs.
Sorry?
There'll be no jobs as your apocalypse.
Well, yes. Thank you. So what I'm saying is that we in the West are becoming only a market for the East, and we could be seeing a serious decline of the West because the dynamism is entirely in Asia. Singapore, you mentioned Korea, Hong Kong, Shanghai, China, and coming along India, as well as coming along is Africa. So we may be debating things which are not relevant to the future.
Okay, yeah, that definitely counts as depressing. Right, anyone else from this side? I promise you could have all three. Otherwise, you're going to forfeit a question back to this side. Last chance. The gentleman at the back had his hand up for a while.
My question is for Professor O'Rourke. The definition of "there's no silver bullet." Do you mean by that there is no solution outside the context of the current discourse of economists? There really isn't an alternative viable policy solution to these problems other than what current economists are thinking about? Is that what you mean by no silver bullet?
It's not what I mean.
Yeah, why don't you do silver bullet first and then...
Yeah, it's not what I mean. I just mean that there's no one cunning plan, some wizard wheeze that will solve all our problems. You know, there's not, Bancor type, international monetary thing, or, just tariffs blanket, or, there's no ones. I think that there are local problems and there are local solutions. There's some global systemic stuff we can think about as well, but that's how I meant it.
Now,
Yeah.
Mary's question on what this has
Yes.
been going on for ages, is anti-globalization.
So I guess on this, in the 1990s, my sense was that a lot of the anger was expressed towards multinationals as opposed to other aspects of globalization, in the sense that multinationals were exploiting people and resources in different parts of the world and preventing those parts of the world from developing. What is odd in one sense since then is that those parts of the world in some cases have developed at a rate of knots. China, we think of now as being a sort of industrial superpower, but it was incredibly poor in the 1980s. In the 1990s it was still incredibly poor. Parts of China still are incredibly poor. India, totally impoverished in the 1980s and 1990s. Now we're complaining about giving foreign aid to India because apparently the Indians are so incredibly rich. So I think what has changed in one sense is, oddly enough, that the investments to a degree in those countries, which were seen to be the cause of so many problems, actually were part of the reason why those countries escaped their difficulties to a degree. And have also, in one sense, illuminated the difficulties that the West now has, because suddenly this is a race which the West appears to be losing, which wasn't expected at all back in the 1980s.
So basically you wouldn't have been at Seattle, but you would have been there for the Occupy protests. That's what you're saying.
I'll be wearing my mask in the Occupy protest because people might spot them.
You wouldn't have worn the HSBC T-shirt.
No,
that would have been poorly judged.
But I think that's kind of what has happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to touch on any of those? So you can either have protests if you're feeling in kind of lefty mode, or you can have robot death for everyone.
Yeah, the robot part scares me because somehow everything we're doing is that, robots don't protest, so therefore automate everything. But I still think it's a bit overblown because at the end of the day, social care is going to that's going to continue to expand and take in a lot of people, as Stephen mentioned.
Also, the robots are taking all the jobs. Why are they so rubbish? Like, employment in most of the developed world has increased significantly since 2000, as has labour market force participation. Can I just try something to get some optimism in this debate? Are we sure that what's not going on is that the United States is a complete basket case, in particular its labour market, which is why its inequality is such a disaster? And then basically what's happened is we've had a financial, and that's a long-term disaster over 30 years. The inequality rising, falling labour market.
I'm waiting with the optimism bit.
I'm coming. No, because but that's bad for Americans. But remember the other thing. It's not us. So they're a basket case on their labour market, and that's what's driving most of this rising inequality. Everybody's losing from capitalism debate, and then basically what's happened is a catastrophic financial crisis, which is really bad, has induced a kind of wave of like everything's a disaster. But in a few years, we're all going to feel a bit silly because everything's going to be kind of okay, because history tells us financial crises take about 10 years on average to work their way through. They'll have passed through, and then we'll be back to discussing how great 2.5% GDP is. I'm just putting it out there.
Can I respond to that, but also to
that's how the questions work,
about the dominance of Asia and how they're doing so well. We talk about the demographics of Africa, but the demographics of East Asia are exactly the reverse. South Korea is aging at a crazy rate, as is Japan, as will be China. So I think it is important to put into context that we can be sort of talk about the dynamism of Africa and so on, but also the places in the world being the fastest growing over the last 30 or 40 years are the ones actually, oddly enough, with the biggest demographic constraint in the next 30 or 40 years. I think that's one important thing to note.
Ireland's one, isn't it?
Sorry?
Ireland's one.
Yes. But
we're not aging, though. I don't think.
No, not at the pace of well, we're all aging, of course, but not at the pace of not at the pace of say South Korea or something. And on this idea of robots taking over, but everything being okay, or eventually, there is something I think genuinely puzzling, not just in the US but also in the UK, which is that on one measure of labour market behaviour, everything looks fantastic at the moment in the sense that unemployment rates are incredibly low, and if we still are in the shadow of a financial crisis, why is it that unemployment rates are incredibly low? But at the same time, unemployment rates are incredibly low. We also have incredibly weak productivity growth and incredibly low wage growth, which is a real anomaly. We haven't really seen this kind of arrangement for many, many years. And I wonder whether, rather than think of technology as something which adds to productivity and adds to living standards the way we normally think about it, it actually has reduced the bargaining position of labour in general and has increased the bargaining position of capital to a degree. So you end up with a story whereby you've got low unemployment, but you haven't got the benefits you normally associate with low unemployment, and that politically again becomes very, very worrisome.
We've got very big self-employment, haven't we?
Well, part of that's again because of technology. Because I mean, I'll give you an example. My daughter, who's old enough to work now, so we sent her out up the chimneys or something or whatever. But she's basically on a 0 hours contract, and she's on the 0 hours contract. It actually suits her to a certain degree, but she's at the end of a phone. She's at the end of a WhatsApp communication or whatever. She can be told, well, we need you today, we don't need you tomorrow. That ability of the company or the employer to monitor what you are doing and request you to arrive at a certain time means that the company can pay you effectively by the hour rather than by the week or the month or the year. There's no commitment to you over that longer time period. But in terms of the advantage to the company, of course, the demand for workers goes up because they can employ them again by the hour rather than in these other different ways. And that, I think, does have a profound effect in terms of the bargaining position of labour.
Yes. We don't have to put up with that. I mean, Ireland is banning 0 hours contracts, I think. And there's been a couple of positive things in the European Union. I think they're thinking, first of all, there was this scam about letting, say, Poles work in the West, which is fine, but bringing Polish labour market regulations and minimum wages with them, which is not fine. And I think that's now no longer, that loophole's been plugged. And I think they're thinking about the Uber type thing as well in Brussels. So, we have free will. We can do what we want.
My point was the growth of Ireland is impressive.
Right, let's get 3 more questions, and then people have got evenings and life to get to. Duncan has been behaving himself very well. Hardly any fidgeting for his question. Who else would like to ask a question?
Try my best. Try my best. I appreciate the point across there about globalisation protests. I remember my misspent youth. My favourite banner I ever saw in a protest was "People of the world unite against globalisation." Fair.
Very good.
The point I was going to ask was that we've been speaking about globalisation ending as we know it. When we look at all the stuff that's happening with China, one road, one belt, this attempt to build Eurasia into some sort of economic union, are we talking about, for want of a better phrase, deglobalization, or are we talking about a fracture into world regions, and how does that affect what Stephen's saying, what Kevin's saying, what everyone's saying?
Okay, great. Anyone else? Or should we just take? And there's a question over here, Rob. Okay, and we'll wrap up.
Yes, I have a question about technology as well. And by the way, before I ask that, just Stephen, on your point about low productivity in technology. Paul Krugman's come up with quite an interesting theory about that, that you've got a handful of companies that are sort of winner takes it all type companies like Facebook, Google, Apple and so on. And then you've got the rest, and that's sort of creating a glut of labour. But anyway, that's not my question. My question is that I declare my bias. I very much believe in this idea of accelerating technology. And there's a lot of... I think that if you look at... Swati, you made the point about the relationship between, in the Brexit vote, between median income and how people voted. But I think there's also a divide between people's attitudes towards technology. And I think you're also seeing a kind of almost like an analog-digital divide. Because a lot of the people who are very anti-Trump or very anti-Brexit have a much more sort of digital mindset. And to give you a couple of examples of that, so one of the technologies that's around the corner is augmented reality. So augmented reality, one of the applications of that will mean within a few years we'll have real-time language translation. So you'll be able to talk to anyone in the world, in any language in the world, providing they've got matching technology, you can have a fluent conversation with them. Other examples of augmented reality would be talking to people by hologram. So you appear in their room. And this is technology which is only a few years off. And isn't that going to have a very positive effect on globalisation?
By positive, what do you mean? As in we can actually have a chat
Well,
with
because
each
it
other?
will change
I mean, that's
people's
nice.
attitudes. That it makes people... It's this sort of concept of a global citizen, which Theresa May is very anti.
I was going to say, have you not been listening to your Prime Minister? There is no such thing.
But I think there is. And I think that it's going to become more pronounced.
Okay, that's a nice positive thing to end on. Technology is going to sort it all out because no one will be an other when we can all translate, we can all speak to each other. Anyway, I'm going to end on Stephen because you can give final words, but Swati, do you want to?
So I'll make it a much broader thing, which is that yes, in the Brexit vote, areas that essentially have never seen many immigrants because those areas don't have many immigrants tend to be the most sort of likely to vote Leave compared to the areas that do have immigrants and they've seen those people and they're probably not as fearful. So I think that analogy that you're bringing up is probably just more generalizable. We always fear what is unknown to us and we like what we see. So I think, yes, there's a definite divide and probably technology will cure all the problems, I think.
And I think everyone should have a go at all the problems. My God, the optimism is totally out of control. Right?
Yeah.
We should all have a go at answering Duncan's question, which is basically a version of your two worlds, which is the result of all this depression total chaos, or is it just lots of poles of globalisation interacting with each other, basically? Swati, do you want to answer that first? Which one of those are you on? Are we heading?
Sorry, I totally
So Duncan's question was, are we heading for chaos and a breakdown of globalisation, or are we really just going to get Chinese globalisation, a bit of European globalisation left, some African globalisation, so it'll be multipolar basically, but
yeah,
not
I think
chaos?
we're headed towards a multipolar aspect, and that's what is showing up in the WTO as well, that you had a stalemate up till now, and now once again there might be some more sounds about we need to revive it. We're starting to hear it in the UK, which is what is even most, like to me, really surprising. So maybe we are heading towards a much more multipolar, inclusive way of doing things.
Kevin?
We're heading towards a multipolar polity, but I don't think that necessarily means we're heading towards a multipolar economy, and whether we're deglobalizing or not depends on your definition. So if globalization is a forward process, well then maybe, but maybe that's not a bad thing, you know. I mean, I hate this bicycle metaphor, you know, for integration or European or global, you know, because then of course you can never stop, but you may just end up going into a brick wall. There's limits to everything. I think that our views should be that what we have is pretty good. Like what the level of integration we have is good enough that poor countries being able to grow by exporting to rich countries, and that's what we want. And we've kept the peace, and so I think we should be conservative and try to conserve what we have. Yeah, Stephen.
Well, first of all, I think we are moving probably towards a multipolar world, but I worry about the relationships between the different poles of that multipolar world. I have a sort of horrible sense that this is a return to sort of 19th century great power games, which ultimately didn't really end very well. And on the technology front, I wanted actually to quote something from the book, but in my defense, it is not my quote from the book, it's someone else's quote from the book. If you can just indulge me for a second. And this is a classic piece of optimism about technology, and I think it does sort of reflect the problems quite nicely. So this says, as technology brought nature increasingly under its control by creating new lines of communication and by triumphing over climatic conditions, it was also proving to be the most dependable means by which to bring nations closer together, furthering their knowledge of one another, paving the way for people-to-people exchanges, destroying prejudices and leading at last to the universal brotherhood of nations. The human race had come out of darkness, fear and hate, and now it was moving forward and upward along a shining road toward the final state of understanding, inner illumination, goodness and happiness. And technology was the most useful vehicle for travelling that road. Now this actually is a sort of speech, or a summary of a speech, or a summary of a view from Davos. But it's not Davos recently, it's Davos in 1913. Because this is actually a reference to the views of Ludovico Settembrini, who's the Italian sort of rational optimist who's in Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. And of course Mann published a book in the 1920s, and Settembrini was effectively the kind of the comic figure without realizing he was a comic figure, because he believed so powerfully in technology and didn't recognize that there were other forces out there that could upset the apple cart. And of course it was a pretty big upset apple cart that emerged in the following few years.
So you thought to end the evening on uplift, you did?
Yeah. I thought
we thought we'd finish on the First World War. Look, can we say thank you to our panel for coming tonight? And thank you to you all for coming. As Kevin has repeatedly argued, free will exists, and the fact that you exercised free will to come here is a cause for optimism, if only for people that run think tanks. So thank you very much, have a good evening, and we'll see you soon.